Eagles Entertainment.
With the 15th pick in the NFL Draft, the Philadelphia Eagles select.
You're listening to the Journey to the Draft podcast.
Welcome to the Journey to the Draft podcast, presented by LifeBrand. I'm your host, Fran Duffy, and we've got two fun segments here for you on today's show. We're going to start things off with Pick 6, where Greg Cosell is going to come by, and we're going to talk through 6 different players, really kind of talking about versatility and why that's so important, especially on the defensive side of the football. So we're going to talk about 3 defensive linemen who have inside-out flexibility, and then 3 corners that have inside-out flexibility. Who are those 6 players? Why do they bring so much value to the NFL? We'll get into that here at the very top of the show. After that, we've got Draft Buzz, where Ben Fennell is going to come by. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the special team stalwarts in this draft and who can really kind of hear their name called on draft weekend, with a big reason being their special teams prowess, but then also go through a really fun mock draft from Lance Zierlein over at NFL.com. We're going to break that all down there in Draft Buzz. As always, the best way to hit us up here on the show, head on over to Apple Podcasts or Stitcher or Spotify, wherever you listen. Leave us a rating, leave us a comment. If you've got a question, we will answer it here in an upcoming show. The draft is 2 weeks from tomorrow, 2 weeks from today, probably when you're listening to this. Unbelievable to say that, 2 weeks from tomorrow, as I'm sitting here recording, that we are so close. So if you've got any questions for this NFL draft, now's the time. Hop on over to Apple Podcasts, leave us a rating, leave us a question in the comment box. We'll answer it here on an upcoming episode. That said, let's get into it. Excited now to catch up with Greg Cosell for Pick 6.
Now it's time for Pick 6.
All right, excited to welcome in this week Greg Cosell. We're really excited for Pick 6. And we're going to talk about some hybrid players here, Greg. Guys that have some inside-outside versatility. And we'll start on the defensive front. And DeMarvin Leal is a guy that was really high in a lot of mock drafts over the summer. Potentially the first interior defensive lineman off the board based off all of those mock drafts. Even up through the fall, you saw him in the top 10, top 12, top 15. I think that's kind of cooled off a little bit. We're not quite seeing him that high in mock drafts, but an intriguing skill set because of that position versatility. Interested to kind of get your thoughts and how you see him moving up to the NFL.
Yeah, I watched him last summer, and I really liked his tape a lot. I thought that he had really strong, active hands. I thought he had quick, athletic feet. He could rush the quarterback off the edge. I thought he had a really good combination of quickness and power. And I was really excited for his 2021. And to be honest, Fran, when I put on his 2021 tape, I thought that you just didn't see those traits as often as I did in 2020. I don't know your thoughts on that. He certainly has the traits, but I think that it just didn't come out as often this year as it did in 2020, which is why you're not hearing about him the way you did last summer or leading into this season.
Yeah, and as you know, you do say all the time with players is we don't know the answers to that, right? So teams get to the bottom of trying. Is that a usage thing? Was there an injury deal? Is there anything else involved there? But I think when you talk about his traits and that position flexibility, I mean, this is a guy that some saw as a defensive end coming out of high school, and even moving into the NFL. Like, it wouldn't shock me. One guy I wrote down while watching him was Michael Brockers, and this is Brockers. When he was coming out of LSU, he was only a 1-year starter. This was 2012. Going back to Brockers, but just when you see a guy that has those level of traits, and Brockers turned into a longtime starter in the league, that skill set makes him a very intriguing proposition for teams, especially with all the multiple fronts we see in today's NFL.
Great point. I was just about to say that. I said that you see a player who played multiple positions across the defensive front, and that kind of alignment versatility is obviously in greater demand than ever before. But I'm really curious to see, number one, who drafts him, and number two, where he gets drafted. But he certainly has traits. It's just that they didn't show up quite as much this year. And I guess he was still a first-team All-American and all that good stuff, but I think that was based on what he did in 2020.
Right. The name recognition part of it certainly comes into play. Let's get into another guy that also has that defensive end, defensive tackle flex, and that's Logan Hall from Houston. Fun player. And I know you recently finished studying him, so I want to get your thoughts fresh here on Logan Hall.
Yeah, I actually did him earlier this week, so he's fresh in my mind. And I've heard about him, obviously, over these last month or so, but I hadn't really seen him play. And I really, really liked his tape. He really grew on me. He started out the season playing a lot more at defensive end. Then as the season progressed, he played a lot more at defensive tackle, which is what I think he is. I think he could be a 3 technique in the NFL and be a very good one. And I tell you what, he's got length. He's over 6'6". He's got natural power. I mean, you saw how many times did he jar offensive guards with his initial hand usage right off the snap of the ball. And he's got athletic movement. There's a little twitch and suddenness to him coming off the ball with that lateral quickness. So I really liked Hall's tape. He's heavy-handed. He's got natural power. He's got athleticism. He can rush the quarterback. I thought that he was really good at coordinating his explosive feet with his active hands as a pass rusher. So I really like Logan Hall's tape a lot, and I think he'll transition well to the NFL.
I am glad that you said you liked him a little bit more as an inside guy. I liked him a little bit more inside as well, but he lined up plenty off the edge throughout the course of his career. I mean, he started his career as a full-time D tackle, but grew into more of an edge presence, especially after they lost Peyton Turner in last year's draft. They relied on him to give some of those edge reps, but I do think that he's probably one of the better pure 3 technique options in this draft. But even still, you look at him and he's like, yeah, like this guy, if you want to line him up head up on a tackle, he could do that and do that well, right? I think he's got enough of that athleticism, enough of that flexibility to be able to do so at a pretty high level.
Yeah, I really liked him. There's a lot of guys who are talked about, and we've done some others who are being talked about as 3 technique types. So here's my bold controversial statement for the day. I like his tape and I like his transition to the NFL better than Devonta Wyatt from Georgia.
Interesting. And Wyatt, obviously, a guy that's being mocked in the top 15, top 20 of a lot of mock drafts at this point in the process. So Logan Hall, a guy not to be slept on here as we see just a couple of weeks from the draft. Another guy, too, we're starting to hear his name pop a little bit more. I think an injury during the pre-draft process has hurt him a little bit, and that's Josh Paschall from Kentucky. I know this is a guy another player that you have studied as well. Different from an athletic standpoint compared to Logan Hall, but give us your thoughts here on Josh Paschall.
Yeah, and I don't think Paschall, I mean, he can play outside. And again, that's why we're doing this. We're talking about guys that have position versatility. So he can play outside. I don't think, well, I shouldn't say that because there were times, who he reminded me of? There were times he reminded me of Shaq Barrett. Okay. And Shaq Barrett came out of Colorado State, 6'1 3/8", 251, ran a 4.73 40, very close to what Paschall ran. And Barrett obviously went undrafted and he spent 4 years in Denver where he was a backup to really good players. And then we obviously know what he's done in Tampa, and he's become one of the better edge rushers in the NFL. I don't know if Paschall's path will be the same, but Paschall, he has really strong hands. Yes. I mean, he's heavy-handed, he's physical. I think the strong, heavy hands and the explosive quickness off the ball to win early in the down. Those 2 traits always play well in the NFL. So again, now it comes down to team and scheme and how they see him, but there's no question that he can line up on the outside. Again, some teams might view his length as being problematic, but like I said, Shaq Barrett's under 6'2", Paschall's over 6'2". So we'll see, but he was a fun player to watch. I imagine you enjoyed it as well.
Yeah, he is a fun player, and the heavy hands absolutely stand out while watching. He's got an outstanding motor. He plays through the whistle on almost every play, and also for our listeners that don't know, has overcome incredible adversity in his life. I mean, was diagnosed with a malignant melanoma. Had 3 surgeries when he first got to Kentucky. So a cancer survivor early in his career that has overcome that level of adversity. Was a 2-time captain for the Wildcats, and obviously they had that big year this year. I think when you look at Paschall, one of the more slept-on players. He was getting ready to head to the Senior Bowl and couldn't go due to an injury. He ended up, I believe, it was a soft tissue. It was a groin injury that kept him out of the Senior Bowl. But I think when you look at Paschall, a player that has that position flex, the Shaq Barrett one is interesting. I did not think about that from that standpoint. He came in a little bit lighter in Indianapolis than I expected. I was expecting him to be a little bit bigger. But yeah, I think with all 3 of these players, it goes back to what we were mentioning is that this is a
a league now where you're seeing so many teams. We're talking about here in Philadelphia, the Eagles played plenty of that 5-2, but so many teams around the NFL are utilizing these fronts, and you're going to need those guys at the drop of a hat, essentially. Mid-series, you've got to be able to switch from playing either a pure 3 to a 4-eye. You're a pure 7 technique, and now you're going to line up head up over tackle as a 4-eye, right? So having that position flex either way is so valuable.
Absolutely. So, but Paschall's a really good prospect. It's just how teams see him.
Yep. All right, well, let's take this conversation to the secondary now, because there are plenty of players that I think also have that inside-outside versatility at the cornerback spot. So whether you're talking about pure outside corners that can slide inside, or some of the slot corners that also have the coverage chops and the top end speed to be able to last on the outside as well. Let's talk we talked about Logan Hall from Houston. Let's talk about his teammate Marcus Jones. Probably more when you talk about body type, that traditional prototype in terms of the nickel. He is more on the undersized side of things. But what did you see from Marcus Jones, the corner from Houston?
I loved watching Marcus Jones. I don't know your feeling. I mean, I loved watching this kid. Obviously, he's 5'8", 174. He can't do anything in the pre-draft process because of injuries. So my guess is he'll run perfectly fine when he does run, if he ever does. But he's got piston-like feet. He has outstanding mirror match press man ability. He's physically tough and competitive. I mean, obviously, he does have a lack of size, and that showed up. A couple of times he vertically he couldn't locate the ball and couldn't make plays on the ball and got beat down the field. But for the most part, this kid was so much fun to watch. He played outside. He played in the slot. He played snaps at safety, which I'm sure you saw. I would think most teams would see him as a slot simply because he's 5'8". But given certain matchups, could he line up on the outside? There are 5'10" wideouts in the league who do play on the outside, and 5'10", 5'8" is not really that big a deal, particularly with the way Jones plays, with that mirror match ability and his physical and mental competitiveness.
Yeah, I think when you look at him and said at that size, I mean, he came in at 5'8", under 175 pounds. And so that is going to bother some people if you're looking at him as an outside corner. But there are definitely some outside corners that are, Jason Verrett isn't too much bigger than that, right? Not feeling healthy. He has been a big time player for, the teams that he has been on. But I think when you look at Jones, I agree. I mean, the foot quickness, the recovery speed, all of that is there. He's also a big time playmaker, both on defense and on special teams. Outstanding production on the football. Nine return touchdowns, 6 as a kick returner, 3 as a punt returner over the course of his career. So I think when you look at what he can do on defense and on special teams, presents a lot of value. Now, we're talking about a guy that probably is more of an inside player, but these next two guys, I think, offer a little bit more when you're talking about that position flexibility. Let's go first to the SEC and Cardell Flot from LSU. Everyone loves to talk about Derek Stingley Jr. for good reason, but Flot, as a junior who declared for the draft as well, shouldn't be slept on either.
No, and he played mostly in the slot, and then Stingley got hurt, and then he played outside as well. So he can do both. He even played some snaps at safety as well, just like Marcus Jones did. The only real knock on him is he's 175 pounds. But I think he's a really interesting prospect. He's very smooth. You can see it in the way he moves. He's got good balance. He's got good body control. I thought he was really good in zone coverage. I don't know your feeling on that. I thought he had a really good feel for playing underneath zone coverage, which he did when he was in the slot. I thought he read routes. I thought he had really good eye discipline. He did play at outside corner as well, and I thought that he showed enough recovery speed that you could see him playing out there. Maybe he can put on a few pounds. And he was really aggressive, despite that thin frame, and he does look thin on tape, but he had an aggressive, competitive mindset. He played the run. He was willing to tackle. He's actually a really good player.
I just have a thing for LSU DBs, but he just watching Flot, I just couldn't help but like him for all the reasons you brought up. There are some things you can knock him on. You mentioned the size, under 180 pounds at being over 6 foot. That's gonna knock him, right? He's got a skinny frame. Only 1 interception over the course of his career, but I'll tell you what, the interception he had was outstanding. It was an outstanding high point interception down the field. But I think I agree in terms of his route quickness and the way that that he was able to read route breaks and stay in the hip pocket of receivers, both in man and in zone, I thought was really, really impressive. And you mentioned the toughness and competitiveness. I thought that showed up as well.
Oh yeah, he's not being talked about at all for obvious reasons. But I think he's a really good prospect. And guys like that, look, he'll probably be seen. Well, I shouldn't say that because I don't know. He is over 6 feet. If he's seen as a slot, he's certainly not going to be drafted high for whatever reason. Teams don't do that, even though slot corners are so critical in today's NFL. But if he's seen as a slot, he's not going to be a top 50 pick. But he strikes me as the kind of guy that's going to be on a roster. He's going to play, and he's going to play in the league for a long time.
Yep. And again, as you mentioned, a guy that I don't think most people knew about, really, even in NFL draft circles until he declared. And so there wasn't a lot of buzz on him. Now, the last guy we were going to discuss, Kyler Gordon, there was plenty of buzz on Kyler Gordon because he was a 3-time member of Bruce Feldman's Freak List. Ben brought him up this past week here on the show when we were talking about the top defensive backs. And Gordon is another guy that he played as a starter on the outside this year, but also not only did he get plenty of slot reps this year, but also going back, he was a big nickel player, a dime matchup piece. He's played a lot on the inside over the course of his career. So interested to get your thoughts there on Kyler Gordon and his transition to the NFL.
Yeah, no, I think, again, you're dealing with a guy that has extensive experience playing in the slot as well. And he's a guy that didn't time real well at the combine, but he plays on tape much faster and more explosively than his time speed. I mean, he looks on tape to me like a pretty dynamic sudden mover. That's the way in which he plays. And he's very, very confident in his speed, Fran, as you probably saw, especially to run with vertical routes. Because when he plays in mirror match press man, he's incredibly patient. It's almost as if he's daring the receiver to run vertically because he knows he can run with him. And I tell you, the one thing about these Washington corners, Trent McDuffie's like this. You can go back years and years. Jimmy Lake was the coach there. Is he still the coach in Washington?
No, he actually just got fired this past year as head coach.
That's what I thought. Yeah.
But before that, he was the defensive coordinator and defensive backs coach. So
right,
big part of the history of DBs there.
Yeah, no question. And they must look for guys or teach guys, because there's 2 things that corners at Washington have done when Jimmy Lake was there. Number one, they're really good with plant and drive from off coverage. These guys are so good. They're decisive. They're sudden in their reactions. And the other thing is they're physical. They tackle. And Gordon is the same way. There's a physical nature to his game. He comes up, he tackles in the run game. He's competitive. You can see he plays with an alpha dog mentality. So Gordon's a really interesting prospect. I think he's not quite as refined in his technique as his partner, Trent McDuffie, but still a really good prospect.
So just talking big picture about these guys, not only with the secondary, but also with the defensive front as well. Obviously, look, this whole discussion is all projection, but how helpful is it to be able to see the guys that have that proven versatility to say, oh, we've seen him play inside and outside versus the guys that, maybe they've only done one and now we have to completely project it in terms of being able to do the other.
I think it's critical. I mean, because once you see it, he can do it. Then if you don't see it, it becomes a projection. Or if you see it and it's bad, even if you think he can do it with your coaching, you can't be 100% certain. But if you see a guy do it and he does it well or reasonably well, where, you just say to yourself, hey, he can do that. I've seen him do it. So now we coach him up. We put him within our scheme. We know he can do that. We know that, hey, if we have to put one of these corners in the slot, they can do that. We know that if we have to put the Marvin Leal, inside, or we in a certain scheme, we want him to rush from the outside. We've seen him do that. We know he can do it. I think that's absolutely critical because everything's a projection anyway, because the level of football increases so dramatically. But if you haven't seen a guy do something in his background, that becomes even a tougher projection.
And the value, again, with these guys, just because of the way that offenses are playing with moving their pieces around, the ability to try and find those matchups, as you know, and as you said many times over the years, it's a matchup-driven league. And so just being able to find ways to create favorable matchups for the defense, that's where these guys bring so much value. Greg, thanks so much for joining us once again here on the Journey to the Draft podcast, presented by LifeBrand. We will talk to you again next week.
Thanks, Fran.
Eagles fans, Merrill Reese here to tell you about the Eagles Autism Challenge, presented by Lincoln Financial Group. This annual Ride, Run, Walk event supports autism research and programming as we work hard every day to advance the conversation from awareness to action. This year's event will take place on Saturday, May 21st at Lincoln Financial Field. With your support, we can help transform the lives of individuals affected by autism. Register today at eaglesautismchallenge.org.
Now it's time for Draft Buzz.
All right, so good stuff there from Greg. Let's now welcome in Ben Fennell here for some draft buzz. And Ben, before we get into our mock draft here this week, one of the things that we talk about a lot here on the show, and we talk about it especially as we get closer and closer to the draft, we actually talked about it a little bit this week here in our DB preview, which, by the way, if you have not listened to our full DB preview, myself, Ben, Dane Brugler talked through all the top corners, all the top safeties. And one topic that came up, Ben, was the value that players can bring on special teams. And so I thought this is something I know you follow very, very closely. And I thought, let me just give Ben the floor. 5 players that you feel will make it and get drafted purely because of special teams. And look, obviously they're going to offer some value on offense or defense as well, but that special teams value is really going to give them a balloon when it comes to their draft prospects. Who's number 1 on your list when I present this question to you?
Yeah, I think adding to special teams contribution just gives you another way to contribute to make the roster and find roles and skill sets. I kind of disagree with the sentiment because I don't think anyone gets drafted purely because of special teams.
Sure.
I think you need to be a positional fit and a contribution on the depth chart first on offense or defense. And then the special teams contributions are then what makes you stick onto a roster. Unless you're a punter or kicker, then I think maybe a little more purely in that regard. But to call someone a special teamer purely typically comes at the expense of some sort of issue on offense or defense. And a lot of these guys kind of have that. So the first one I think is Percy Butler out of Louisiana. Best coverage guy, in my opinion, on kickoff and on punt, 25 tackles in his career. And you really saw that at the combine with his 4.36 speed. And the second he can beat some jammers, really show that open field, linear speed, getting down there first. He just has average safety skills, though. Instincts on the back end kind of leave a little bit to be desired. Man coverage skills, I think, are very raw. He, I think, really embodies the Matthew Slater type. Coming out of UCLA, Matthew Slater was also a back-end safety that ended up being just a special team stalwart in the NFL. I think Percy Butler is a perfect mold for that type.
Yeah, and I think when we talked about this earlier this week, but when you take Percy Butler and you look at the way he tested, he's tested pretty well throughout this pre-draft process. And you say, okay, Percy Butler, a good athlete, has already shown that he can play on special teams. I think that's just like a feather in his cap. And you say, okay, any of the warts he has as a safety, you still feel good about him making the team as a third or fourth safety because of that special teams value. And I guess that's where I meant in terms of framing it that way, purely because of special teams. Because if he didn't have that feather in his cap, then you would say, all right, well, now I'm not quite sure what he brings, what value he brings. But if you say, okay, we know this guy can come in and be a quality special teams player while also being a backup safety, that really kind of helps you. I think Butler is a great example. I'm glad you led off that list with him. Who would be number 2 for you?
Yeah, Matthew Slater was a receiver. I've just corrected that there at UCLA. But a couple other guys I think have some hybrid skill sets, some hybrid positional fits. They're a little bit caught in between where you want to play them on defense. So their special teams contributions, I think, make them draftable prospects and extremely high-level candidates to make rosters. I'm going to hit you with 2 right off the bat here, and that's Darian Beavers out of Cincinnati, who's very much a hybrid Sam edge rusher with over 700 special team snaps in his career between Cincinnati and UConn. Just seems like this type of player is coming out every year, whether it's Zaven Collins and Derek Barnes last year, Jelani Tavai the year before. Well, Beavers is more athletic than that group. I think this kid's a better special teams contribution, a better roster piece than maybe Tavai or Derek Barnes was. And in that same conversation, Kansas outside linebacker Kyron Johnson, another guy that's kind of caught, positionally in between positions, whether you want to play him off ball or Sam, or is he just a sub rusher? Another guy that was able to show off that change of direction and speed with over 600 special team snaps in his career. So he's only 6 foot 230, certainly not a consistent every down presence off the edge. Yep. But these guys, Beavers, Johnson, I think the hybrid skill set, the tweener skill set, I think the special teams contribution just makes them a more apropos piece to fit the roster.
No, that's a great point, especially with Johnson. When you talk about, okay, hey, look, we don't think he could be a 3-down rusher, but he can come in and be a role player in our rush package. You know, when it's our exotic looks from a pressure standpoint, 3rd and long, he can offer some value there and also be a core guy in special teams. Huge value. Who's next up on your list?
Yeah, and you know, when you're making those late August decisions on your board and who's going to make the roster, and hey, this one guy can play 4 special teams for us, this guy doesn't, becomes pretty easy decisions. And I think personnel guys and the roster constructors like having those decisions because it's not that hard to make. And I feel like you get a lot of that with returners on the back end too, because the returners can come in and maybe play slot in a pinch or play scat back or maybe even carry the ball. So 2 returning types, in my opinion, each on both sides of the ball.
Okay.
We know about Marcus Jones at Houston, former receiver, converted to corner, really good corner skill set as well. Tons of plays on the ball, but his prolific returning ability will make him, obviously, I think, make a roster with an NFL team. And then another one maybe people aren't aware of is Tristan Ebner out of Baylor.
Great one.
Prolific run pass threat, on the offensive side, catches the ball a ton out of the backfield, but he's back-to-back Big 12 Special Teamer of the Year. Tons of big returns, tons of contributions in coverage. So Tristan Ebner, Marcus Jones, prolific returners, and then we'll see where else can they fit and contribute.
I love that. And Jones, a guy we talked about in the last segment with Greg, we talked about the 9 return touchdowns in his career, just an outstanding production on that side of the football. Ebner, again, a guy that's kind of flying under the radar there. So I'm glad you were able to kind of break these up into some different categories.
Was that 5 there? Or was that 4 there?
That was 5. You gave us Butler.
Oh, that was 5. Yeah.
Butler, Beavers, Johnson, Jones, and Ebner. So we had 5 guys there.
I had one extra one here. I had Nolan Turner out of Clemson. All right, Nolan Turner out of Clemson. Older prospect. Reminds me a little bit of like a Chris Maragos coming out of Wisconsin, was a special teams ace for us here in Philadelphia for a number of years, special teams captain. I think Nolan Turner, I think the age may concern you a little bit, but his experience in high-level games at Clemson and his special teams background, that's the type of guy you kind of pick up the phone early as a priority free agent, and he ends up making the roster.
I love it. Yeah, a bunch of these guys profile from that standpoint, whether it's coverage, the core units, or as a returner. Huge.
And there were some major contributors, Fran, but I don't think they're going to get drafted purely for that contribution. So the guys like Tyson Andersons of the world and Kobe Bryant's, I think, have much higher skill sets on their side of the ball. And the special teams contribution. That's why Anderson and Kobe Bryant are going in, round 3, round 4, and these other guys are probably late day 3 priority free agent.
Great point. And that's the thing when you take those guys, early day or late day 2, early day 3, that you at least have that as like the floor, right? You take Tyson Anderson and you say, look, this is what this guy can be as a safety. He's really, really exciting with his tools. At his floor, he's a backup safety, core special teamer, but with his athletic prowess, with his size and his length, he could be that matchup player. And that when you get into that area of the draft, into those early rounds, and those guys have that special teams background, that's just more like sets the floor for us.
Yeah, and it's fun looking at the first rounders that also do special teams. I mean, McDuffie, Kyler Gordon, Jameson Williams has big hits as a punt gunner out there. Kyle Hamilton does as well. Plenty of first rounders you can find on special teams too.
No doubt. So with that said, let's now get into the first rounders and talk through this mock draft roundup this week. We're going to go over to NFL.com. Lance Zierlein, who does an outstanding job with these mock drafts, is so plugged in as always, especially as we get later in the process. Lance consistently one of the more accurate mock drafters out there. And so and he's always out ahead of a lot of this buzz. And so we're going to get into the top 5 because there's some interesting takeaways there. But first, let's get into these 2 Eagles picks here. First with number 15, cornerback Trent McDuffie. Here's the blurb here from Lance. Philadelphia has an obvious void at one cornerback spot, and McDuffie gives the Eagles one of the stickiest, toughest man corners in the draft. And so, Ben, McDuffie becoming a hot name for the Eagles lately in mock drafts. We talked about him last week in Bruce Feldman's mock draft as well. I think it's notable that Lance kind of labeled him as a man-to-man corner. Well, you called him the best zone corner in round 1 earlier this week. And not to say that one's right, one's wrong. I think that speaks more to McDuffie's versatility and the value he presents in the middle of the round 1.
Yeah, absolutely. Washington has been trending against man coverage the last few years, actually second fewest man coverage reps in cover 1 this past year in the Pac-12. So, but his positional versatility and scheme versatility, I think, is what makes him so valuable in a mid first round pick with his athletic skill set and his explosiveness and just his toughness, his rawness, his special teams, his run support, in protecting the flat, the ball skills. There's a lot to like with Trent McDuffie. I don't think he's a scheme-specific type of player. I think that's why he goes 15th overall. He's going to be a really nice piece for Jonathan Gannon.
Feel safe to say like he's a high floor player, right? You would look at McDuffie in that way.
Absolutely. And, he's a guy I think maybe can slide in to do some nickel stuff as well with his toughness and blitzing ability. And I think he's a guy I can get a lot of use out of. And at the end of the day, his high floor, you go run down on punt coverage for me all day long and kickoff coverage. He's a guy willing to contribute and, plug it where it leaks, wherever it needs.
All right, well, let's get to the next pick here. 18 overall. This is the pick from the New Orleans Saints. Lance has the Eagles selecting Arkansas wide receiver Treylon Burks. Here's the blurb from Lance. Jalen Hurts needs another weapon on offense, and Burks is one of the most well-rounded in the draft, combining size, athletic ability, play strength, and run after the catch capability. Ben, it's been a while here since we did a mock draft with Treylon Burks to the Eagles. So really, it's been a couple months, it feels like, since we've covered one here on this show. So I'm interested, now that we're just a couple weeks out, just thoughts on Treylon Burks, his fit here in this Eagles offense, in this passing game, and your thoughts. I know his stock has kind of gone through a little bit of a roller coaster ride due to the combine and things like that. Interested to kind of get your thoughts as we sit here in mid-April on Burks.
Well, I would love to see his complementative kind of frame and skill set really, counter some of the existing receivers and the Devontaes and Jalen Reagor and Quez Watkins and some of those guys that are a little bit lighter frame, quick twitch, over the top guy. And Treylon Burks is thick. He's 225. He's 6'3". He's the guy you want to put the ball in his hands, and he's got the juice to run away from pursuit, but he's going to break some tackles like a running back too. So I just love to see kind of his skill set and a lot of different ways you can use him in the offense, whether it's the perimeter screens, put him in the backfield. He can win deep. I mean, he torched some Texas A&M press corner vertically, and no problem doing that in the SEC. So Treylon Burks, I really am excited to see how he's going to be used in the NFL. And I think Nick Sirianni would just be licking his chops to have Devontae Smith and Treylon Burks and Miles Sanders and Dallas Goedert. A lot of weapons around Jalen Hurts.
Yeah, Burks, just a fun player, right, in terms of his usage and the way that he can be deployed, but also the skill set there. Just a really, really intriguing player because of his toolbox. Let's now get into the top 5 in this draft. And I mentioned I wanted to get to it because a little bit of a shakeup here. Lance going Trayvon Walker, the Georgia defensive end, number 1 overall to the Jacksonville Jaguars. That caused Aiden Hutchinson to fall number 2 to Detroit. Ben, we've seen a lot of smoke here over these last couple of weeks, especially in the recent days here, with Walker potentially going number 1 overall. 5 months ago, I think that we would have been shocked by that statement.
Yeah, and that's the way things have been trending. And, Lance is typically ahead of the curve with some of this stuff, just like our buddy Dane Brugler. They seem to be the two that have thrusted him up their mock drafts. And that's seemingly, how the NFL views it as well. So I think it's a fun conversation. It's a bit contentious based on, Trayvon Walker's production and body of work and projection moving forward. So I love it. And I love not knowing that number 1 pick. Every now and then, yeah, it's fun to have the, Trevor Lawrence is going 1 for 3 months, but I love the occasional drafts where you really don't know. So I hope it holds on for just another 2 weeks of unknown. And that first envelope and Goodell going to the podium, I love the suspense behind it all.
I will say that night 1, if Trayvon Walker goes number 1, look, when we do the podcast, we're obviously going to recap what the Eagles do in the first round of the draft. But we got to throw some flowers at Dane Brugler for him being the first one to stand on the rooftop and scream the name of Trayvon Walker as a top 10 talent in this draft. And so, we'll see exactly where he ends up going. But Walker going ahead of Hutchinson in this mock draft, just rounding out the top 5. Evan Neal, number 3 to the Houston Texans, which is something I could definitely see playing out. Sauce Gardner going number 4 to the New York Jets. And then number 5, Oregon pass rusher, Kayvon Thibodeau going to the New York Giants there at 5th overall. Any thoughts there on those, the back end there of the top 5?
One of the earlier slots, we've seen Sauce Gardner go 4th overall to the Jets there. They have some pretty clear needs at corner, some pretty clear needs at pass rusher opposite Carl Lawson, hoping he has a nice, healthy season, and add some weapons around Zach Wilson. That may be a spot number 4 for Joe Douglas to trade back and maybe add some Morse picks there. So I think that 4, 5, 6 spot, the draft is really going to start up there.
All right, well, let's do what we typically do and just kind of cut the draft in half. Look at the front 16 and the back 16. What's one pick, one player team fit that you just love in the front 16, the first 16 picks of this mock draft?
I love seeing George Karlaftis go to Baltimore at 14.
Yeah,
kind of a new defensive regime, but I think it's going to kind of resemble the previous, Wink Martindale and the kind of exotic multiple front. And I think Karlaftis is a guy that's going to stand up off the edge and base and then be moved around or even walking around in some sub packages. They can use some pass rush help. It's been no secret they're into it in free agency. Some hit, some didn't. And I think a George Karlaftis would be a great Ravens type of pick there.
And honestly, like my pick goes in the same vein. Jermaine Johnson going to the Jets at number 10. When you look back at the Ravens, the way that they have attacked pass rusher in the draft, more often than not, they're going production. And they also place a ton of value on the Senior Bowl and guys that go down there and compete at a high level. And some of the top Senior Bowl standouts end up in Baltimore on a yearly basis. So for Jermaine Johnson, I think that makes a ton of sense. For Joe Douglas at number 10, remember, Joe Douglas coming originally from Ozzie Newsome in that Baltimore tree. I think it checks a lot of boxes there. And the Jets also pretty active in the pass rush market here this summer. And just
that'd be a fun front there, Frank. Quinnen Williams, Sheldon Rankins on the inside, Carl Lawson, and Jermaine Johnson on the outside. Suddenly you got a pretty dominant four right there.
Yeah, Franklin Myers. You got a couple of the other young guys there. That would be a fun group for certain. So let's go to the back 16 here. I'll let you go first. Who's a player from 17 to 32 that you really like?
Well, I know New England just moved on from Shaq Mason, shipping him off in a trade. So plugging in a big Kenyon Green, who I think is a great gap scheme, power type of interior offensive lineman that just seems like the style of Patriot offensive linemen, whether it's Michael Owenu or Shaq Mason and some of those bigger refrigerator types that need to move people off the ball. Kenyon Green latches and runs his feet in the power game as well as anybody in this class. He's a guy that's played up and down the line, could end up being an Elton Jenkins type for somebody, maybe New England. I just really love that fit, and he'll probably be a mainstay right guard for him.
Yeah, it's a great fit. And when you talk about the versatility that they typically value up front, Kenyon Green certainly brings that with having experience at both tackle spots, both guard spots. Real quick, for me, I would say Jameson Williams at the Saints at number 19. I think you could really say this with Williams for a number of teams picking in this draft. But I think when you look at his speed, kind of plugging him in, that's a dimension that the Saints are sorely missing. And adding him with a vertical thrower like Jameis Winston, I think makes a ton of sense. So Jameson Williams, even if you want to say like Chris Olave there with the Saints, I think makes a lot of sense.
Yep.
You can take Williams and say, Kansas City, the Chargers, right? You can go through, Green Bay, plenty of teams could use that game-breaking speed that he certainly brings to the table.
Yeah, absolutely. The last one I want to throw in there, I love seeing Kyron Elam go to Buffalo in the back end there. He just seems like a Sean McDermott type of corner who tested out of this world. I think is a much better zone corner and a very feisty corner as well. So I think he'd be a great fit.
Any names stand out to you, Ben, that were left off this mock draft? Who do you think's first off the board when it's all said and done?
All right, what do we got here? At round 2, the big board, Lance. Check the receipts. We got Linderbaum still on the board. Zion Johnson. Ooh, how about Kyron Elam, Kyler Gordon go over Andrew Booth? Seems like that's the way things have been trending the last week or two. How about Devin Lloyd, the only first-round linebacker?
Yep.
No Nakobe Dean, no Christian Harris, no Quay Walker.
Yep.
That's kind of a unique pecking order right there. So always some fun exercise to see who's left on the big board. A lot of value in round 2, a lot of receivers, a lot of running backs that come off the board, tight ends. How about all those safeties on the back end? Dax Hill, Jalen Petrie. Certainly it seems the way it's trending.
No question. Well, this is always a fun exercise, and we'll continue to do it. We only have a couple more weeks of doing it, Ben, here on the Mock Draft Roundup on the Journey to the Draft podcast presented by LifeBrand.
Well, great stuff there from Ben. Again, we'll be back next week. Ben, Dane, myself, we've got wide receiver preview, one of the deeper positions in this draft. So if you want to learn more about the wide receiver class here in the 2022 NFL Draft, stay tuned for next time right here on the Journey to the Draft podcast presented by LifeBrand.